Ki te whakarongo, ki te titiro, mātou tangata tino rongo nui I te tairāwhiti. So, ka timata mātou ki te tahi karakia e ka hoatu au te rākau ki a tātou manuhiri. Kia Jude, Jude Katarai, karai tiana, tēnā koe whaia, ki te mihi ki a koe, kai a mātou hoa I tēnā uniana, ki te whaia, tuahi ne rānei tea, ki te tino taina koe hoki. Kia tina ngata no mai hara mai ki tēnei wā, ka timata au ki te tahi karakia, mā koutou, mā tātou, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina te uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. He hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora. So, yeah, kia ora koutou. So our first speaker today is going to be Tina Ngata, and this actual seminar will be recorded and there will be information in your emails about how you can connect up to this. This will be on Facebook as well. So ka hoatu au te rākau ki tēnei wāhine tino a tāhua ki te kōrero tēnei kaupapa. Tēnā koe Tina.
Tēnā koe te whanau. Ngā tira kia koutou o te riuroa, he mihi anō kia koutou katoa mai tēnei mokopuna no te tairāwhiti, o te raku hikurangi te maunga, ko Waiapu te awa, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, ko te whānau karuai, te whānau tūwhakiiri ora, te whānau Henerupe, Ngāti Horoai, Ngā Hapu, tēnā koutou katoa. He mihi anō kia koe kōka Robin, kia koutou ngā kōka kua karanga mai kia wai, kia noho tahi, kia wānanga tahi e pāna ki ngā tino kaupapa o te ao nei. Yeah, lovely to have received the invite to spend some time and chat with you all today around these really important issues, and particularly, you know, in what seems to be the year of important issues, multiple important issues arriving on our doorsteps. And of course, it's an election time and it's a very potent political period that we're at, both in terms of discussing issues of racism, on top of the fact that we are, you know, on the doorstep of an election, and of course, economic and health issues and the ever-present existential crises of climate change that are sitting all around us as well. So we're sitting in times that are, you know, I don't like the word unprecedented, but we're sitting in times of great intersections of power and intersections of importance, where decisions that are made will have huge ramifications for in the very immediate future. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the kōrero. I was asked to speak a little bit to one of the journeys that we're on at the moment in Te Tairāwhiti, and I'm intending, I guess, to connect that journey out to larger spaces as well, and that's the anti-racism journey that we've recently committed to through council. And you know, I guess when I tell this story about how we kind of came to get to the point where we're at, and we're still kind of only just at the beginning, it's taken a lot of work to get to the starting line, but we're at the starting line now. But a lot of this work, and I think a lot of work in dealing with discrimination as well, in general, sits from a deep-seated belief that we are all, and it doesn't sound, you know, people don't reflect on this often, but in order to continue to do this work, you have to have a belief that at the end of the day, we are all good people. and that that humanity generally does believe in basic concepts of justice and human rights. And there are laws and rules that help us to, navigate spaces where our ideas of what's right or just might come into conflict. And it would be naive to say that there aren't people out there that are genuinely driven by self-interest, but more often than not, people are good. And, and we see that come through when the world starts to get us down. We see these amazing feats of humanity and generosity and aroha and caring that come to the fore and inspire us about our greatest potential. And that's really what sits behind our push is this consistent belief that we can do better, that we do have our eye on this goal of justice. And it's just consistently framing and bringing the voices in to frame what justice actually looks like. That is the work that's before us. And so one of the things that I've learned over the years of being involved in human rights issues is that where conflict exists, it's really important to listen to people's stories, because we're hardwired to hear ourselves in those stories. And from the beginning of time, sitting around fires, we have told stories in order to influence others, and we've embedded moral messages in those stories about who is right and what is just and what's acceptable and what's normal. And these stories influence people, and they define values, and they shape identities. And when nations tell their stories, that's a way of also shaping their national identity. And within that, there are suggestions about what individuals should be like if they are to reflect their national identity, if they're to belong on that land. And similarly for regions like to tell their stories in a way that shapes I guess in a way that their regional identity, and within that is a series of assumptions around how you should behave and what it is to be normal within that region, within that area. And so that will also not just frame your identity, but it will frame your work streams. It'll frame your trajectories around where it is you think you should be heading and the work that you want to set in front of you, or the work that you don't want to set in front of you. And so what we see in nations like Australia and Canada and the United States and New Zealand, nations that have undergone a colonial experience, we see these very similar themes coming up in the stories of their nation. It's that Indigenous peoples lived in some kind of prehistoric period. By prehistoric, that means that they're not formally included in the history of the nation, because they are prehistory. And the history starts when the discoverers or explorers show up, and that they have shown up as a consequence of the European Enlightenment. So they're an extension of Enlightenment and advancement and civilization, and that's the period that is marked by their arrival. And that usually their arrival marks also the birth of a great nation. And so that's generally the colonial perspective of their experience of colonization. And then, of course, we have the Indigenous narratives, our own versions of that experience, which is generally something along the lines of we have already had a long-standing history that embeds us in the lands and the waters. And then Europeans showed up, and our worlds were turned upside down kind of from that point on. There's a lot of other ways you can take that story, but those are the general themes that you have across all of those nations. And so usually, within that, there's also, so those are two stories, but there's also a third story in there, because when we talk about that colonial perspective, we are also usually injecting a colonial perspective of how Indigenous people experienced that as well. So they're usually saying things like, whatever misfortune that we underwent is a misfortune that it was worth it. It was worth it because of what we've gained out of colonization. That we were primitive or prehistoric, that we needed civilizing, and that we've ultimately benefited from the colonial experience, that it's provided doorways into the modern world and into global politics. At least that we benefit enough from it to justify maintaining that state. And that's a really important aspect for us to remember, is that national stories set national trajectories. And if the national story is one that, or a regional story, or a sectoral story is one that upholds colonialism as benevolent, then we will never set a course to decolonize. It will continue to suggest that Indigenous erasure is acceptable, or, as was recently suggested by the Minister for Children, that the state theft and abuse of Māori children requires a more Pākehā lens. And there's another story for us to consider within all of that as well, within the chronicles of colonial history, and that is the story of European imperialism. And that is the story that we really worked hard to push to the forefront during the 2019 state-funded anniversary events around Captain Cook. And I think, you know, we've been telling the story a lot. We managed to shift, I believe, the trajectory of the story of what was intended to be told, and force in the story of the doctrine of discovery, which, you know, to bring everybody up to do a little bit of a season recap so that we're all up on the same episode, I'll just quickly go over it. The doctrine of discovery is essentially an international legal concept that justifies the invasion and claiming of Indigenous lands, and the dispossession and dehumanising of Indigenous peoples, so long as it is done as a process of European imperial expansion. And there were papal bulls that were issued, papal laws that were issued in the mid-15th century to justify that process. Those papal laws have never been rescinded, and they essentially said that European nations are allowed to go out and claim lands and expand their empires. And not just that they can do it, but that it's the good Christian duty to do it. And so those have gone on to become foundational laws in international treaty law, foundational laws in international law. Inter se terra, one of those papal laws, became foundational in international law. And of course, because they set up systems of extraction and imperial domination over what is called the Third World, or the global economic south, and they filled the coffers of European nations with Indigenous money and Indigenous resources, and they set the scene for global economic injustice, which is still enduring today. And I guess that's another really important point, that the time that I have with you, that I want us to hold on to, that these are enduring injustices, that these aren't just something that happened in the past. There is no statute of limitations on human rights abuses or crimes against humanity. And when you are talking about the political dispossession of an entire population, that is under international law deemed to be a crime against humanity. It's a crime against an entire peoples. And so why is it that you would be able to do that if you were, say, a European nation seeking to exert power in the Middle East, or exert power somewhere else, or in the Pacific? Yet, if other people do it, it's seen as a crime against humanity, and they would be they would be go to trial at The Hague or whatnot. And there's, as I said, no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity. This injustice is an enduring one. So these were some of the knowings that we took with us into 2019, was that these injustices are enduring injustices. They have been recognised by the United Nations, and we've been to the United Nations with this issue before, but they've been recognised by the United Nations as issues that need to be embedded in education curriculums, and that's been a formal recommendation by the UN, that education on the doctrine of discovery be embedded into national curriculums. And they've also recommended that member states or signatories to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples explicitly repudiate the doctrine of discovery and begin work to dismantle it. And unsurprisingly, most nations, well, in fact, no nations have responded to those recommendations. And so, you know, after a year of these kinds of discussions in 2019 and embarking upon what local and central government believed to be or said were very educational discussions for them around the nature of the experience of colonisation on this land, we found ourselves a few months later with the Gisborne District Council looking to approve the raising of these Endeavour replicas in Gisborne, and it really highlighted to people just how far we still had to go in understanding the enduring injustice of colonisation, and how important it is for us to really listen to each other's stories and listen to that broader story of how imperialism is not only applied across these lands, but also maintained. Usually it's maintained through these stories where they will uphold particular people as heroes and define particular acts as being honourable, and also subdue or oppress or suppress the injustices. So, you know, I guess the question that this leads to us is that if these are enduring injustices, if we know that, if we accept that, for instance, Te Tiriti o Waitangi accorded kawanatanga, which is a sub-sovereign right, not a sovereign right, but a sub-sovereign right, kawanatanga, to the Crown or to the Governor, and accorded rangatiratanga, which is absolute authority, to Marae, and then a government was set up in violation of that fact, then we know that the government and the subsequent legislation that came out of that is a violation of Te Tiriti and is not operating under the provisions of Te Tiriti. So that is an enduring injustice, because that's still the case today. And so if it's not operating under the provisions of Te Tiriti, then under what provisions, under what right or authority could it be drawing from in order to maintain its authority and a just idea of control? And the answer to that really is the only other doctrine that it would be drawing down from would be the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of domination, where it believes that it has an ultimate right to be able to exert its authority in that space. And so, again, insofar as this is an enduring injustice that internationally has been called upon to be decried and repudiated, then you know, that there's a space there for us to consider, what are we going to do about that? And of course we can wait for central government to do something, but we don't have to. And that was the point that we made very clearly to Gisborne District Council when it became really apparent that we had not learnt the lessons that they said that they were learning in 2019, that there was still a long way for us to go, for us to understand where each other stood. And so, and that racism, which was carried around the world, racism was created through the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is what set the precedent for the West African slave trade, and it created narratives that justified the slave trade by saying that black bodies were mainly good to be traded, to be monetized, to be used for profit. That's words that are actually in the paper that you can use them for profit, use their bodies for profit. And the idea that Indigenous peoples are not human or are in need of saving or are infants. You know, these are racist ideas that were embedded in these papal laws that have survived and endured over time, that have worked their way into international and national laws and treaty law and have shaped the social psyche around us. So the story that we're talking about really is about the birth and maintenance of racism. And this is why it's been called upon for people to start to understand the story and start to dismantle it, because it doesn't do any of us justice. And so how do we do that? Well, you know, based upon, we've started a journey in Gisborne District Council, which is based upon the idea that if we accept that it is replete throughout society, because we have been legislatively shaped through the doctrine of discovery, and psychologically shaped and influenced, and economically shaped and influenced the doctrine of discovery. If we accept that it's everywhere, there's no reason for us to believe that we would be an exception in Gisborne District Council. There's no reason to believe that the University of Waikato would be an exception. There's nowhere that would be an exception to this. And so what is your individual or your institutional or your organisational capacity to respond to this, regardless of what's happening elsewhere? And what we defined is that the first thing that we need to do is understand our racialized history. So we are embarking upon a research project that will look at the specific racialized history, how the doctrine of discovery came to be carried into Te Tairawhiti and Gisborne District, and also how it has shaped our local policy and how our local policy has influenced and shaped and sometimes perpetuated racism as well. Based upon that research and that very intimate understanding of what it looks like in our context, we'll also be shaping training modules and workshops that will be ongoing for both council and staff. It will also include a policy evaluation matrix to make sure that whatever policies we develop, similar to these days, you know, you have climate evaluation matrices to make sure that policies do not perpetuate climate. It's like an overlay to make sure that it doesn't have any negative climate consequences. Similarly, we'll be having an overlay to make sure that we don't perpetuate racial disparities through our policies. And then an assessment monitoring process to look at how we are progressing as time goes on. But it starts with an acknowledgement that racism is everywhere and that we all have a responsibility to address it. And, you know, where it goes from there is going to be dependent upon the people who are involved. But we're excited. We're excited for the journey to be beginning, and for the stories. You know, there's still a lot of stories to be uncovered through this space. It is much more than telling our settlement stories. Similarly to what I'd said at the beginning, you have the Pākehā stories, then you have the Indigenous stories. And I think, you know, a lot of us have told our settlement stories, and those are our Indigenous stories, but we also need to cast that broad lens over what happened when people came here and some of the drivers behind that and how it manifests in our world today and what we're going to be doing about it. So I think I've gone over time, and you wanted to have some kōrero about it. I could go on forever about this stuff.
So I'm just gonna, we did have, well, we do want to have some whakawhiti kōrero with Jude
Sure.
as well. But he pātai ki a koe, whaia Judith, did you want to have, do you have any questions, or did you want to kōrero your kōrero, and then we can do a big whakawhiti kōrero atu mutunga?
I think I'll do mine first, and then we'll do a whakawhiti kōrero after that, because there are quite a few things that Tina has brought up that I'm really inspired about when we're looking at area councils throughout the union, you know.
Okay.
So I'll do my spiel first. So tēnā kapai. So tēnā tātou te katoa o ngā member o te uniana o te reo rui roa. So nā mihi ki a koutou. Just to bring up on the history for me, ko Jude Karaitiana, I'm the dual chair for the Central East Area Council. It's one of 14 councils throughout Aotearoa. And the journey for dual chairpersons for Central East started over 20 years ago, and it was brought forward by a beautiful lady called Dawn Karangaroa from Wairoa. At that time, she was sitting with David Henderson, who was our branch, our Tauiwi representative. So we had Marae and Tauiwi in the area council, regional council at that time. But it's taken a long progression to have dual chairpersons recognised. And it wasn't until 2003, 4, 5, at annual meeting in Wellington, through David Henderson and Whakaata Stewart, that it was actually acknowledged by annual meeting that the status of dual chairs. Dual chairs, who are they? We represent middle Māori and mainstream. That's who we are. And through the hard working of both Whakaata and David, dual chairpersons came about. So I've been the dual chairperson for Central East for 10 years at the end of November this year. I had to go back and see how long I've been there. But when I look at Central East Area Council, we are driven by 3 po: whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, and te akitanga. And that has grown. It didn't happen overnight. Just like you said before, Tina, it takes a while for things to get started. So it happened when I first came on board 10 years ago. It was sort of slightly there, but it's just progressed as the years have come across. And it's about building the relationships between myself and another mainstream member, and that we understand each other as we go about. So our area covers from Hikurangi all the way down to Tamaki Nui Arua. It's from Poverty Bay through to Dannevirke. We were the first area council in Aotearoa for the NZI to have dual chairpersons. The second in recognition for Kia ora Taranaki. If you're viewing this session, they were the second to have dual chairs. Didn't happen overnight for all of us. You had to have the consultation over and over and over again with your mainstream members for it to come about. So, yep, it's taken a long journey. It's a long journey for us. So Central East Area Council, I have to say, is a classic example, in my view, of duality. We're both middle Māori and mainstream. We both are represented in leadership roles in our area of the Central East Area Council for NZI Te Rui Roa. So, like I said, it hasn't come about, it hasn't been an easy journey. So, for us, this has just come about at the right time, Tina, to have this discussion with you as well, because we are focusing on mōku te ao. And so it's about our world. How do we see it? How does it work together with both Māori and mainstream? So for our area council, when we come together, you know, we're so used to doing the norm. We are. We're so used to doing the norm over and over again, albeit in all our best interests and our best intentions. So is that enough? So, you know, from our point of view, we do need an action. We need only one action, to make a change, a substantial change, or albeit, quote from Kiri Milne Ihimaera, it is a fundamental transformative change. So, and for us, when I look at my area council, are we fully committed to do this? Do we have the tools to do that? Or are the tools there, but they just haven't come about? What do I need to do as an area council chair to trigger that, to light that fire that's already there, to ignite it? So, so that's what we're all about in Central East. And I must say, and acknowledge my members for Central East, we talk a lot together. For mainstream and middle Māori, we make the decision together. Next to me sits my mainstream chairperson, and at the moment she's an interim chairperson. But in order to have that flow and discussion, in order to have to ignite the discussion, the robust discussion that we talk about, you have to understand what a kaupapa is. Do we have the understanding of a kaupapa like moku te ao? I don't believe we do across NZEI. I think it is up to middle Māori to ensure that all our councils do have an understanding of that. It's our world and how we work together. What is the best journey for us in an institution like NZEI? So I'll leave it there, but I do have a question, and I wrote down quite a few notes from you, Tina. And I looked at it from the colonial perspective as well, providing the doorways into the global looks to justify our actions. And I'm looking from the point of view like for the union. So how could you see that happening for us, Tina?
Well, I think, tēnā koe, first of all, thank you for enlightening and te whakawhāriki mai o tō kōrero, he mihi anō ki a koe i te kōka, i tēnei kōrero, i tēnā kōrero. And so, what I think the first thing that we need to do always, and I'm a researcher, so I'm always going to say this, is to understand the story, understand the full story of the doctrine of discovery. Especially when we say, under the idea of nōku te ao, a big part of understanding the doctrine of discovery, especially when we come back to the space of understanding justice, you'll never understand what justice looks like unless you understand the injustice that's happened. And so if you're not able to identify the injustice and understand the injustice that's happened, you'll never know what justice looks like. If you don't know what justice looks like, you'll never know your due. You'll never know what you're due. So you will permit people to continually tell you that it's in your better interests that they make this decision for you, or it's in your best interests that this gets done for you or taken off you, because you'll never know what your full due is. And so understanding first and foremost the story of the doctrine of discovery is important for all organisations and institutions. When we understand that, I think also it's really important for us to understand the psychological impacts of that. And so if we have a look at how law shapes psyche, social psyche, a good example is, that I consider to be a good example is cannabis law. Now, our ideas, and we have the referendum coming up very soon, our ideas around cannabis have shifted and swayed a lot in the past few decades. We went from prescribing it in the 1950s, we were prescribing cannabis in different areas in Aotearoa, to 1965 outlawing it. And once it became outlawed, not long after that, you had a huge public health campaign that pretty much cast it as being evil, the devil's weed, it will send you crazy and manic, and there was a lot of misinformation out there about that. Then we came to understand it as just something that kind of made people lazy, but also that it had mental health implications. But still there was this pervasive socialized idea that it's very, very bad for you and only very, very bad people partake in it. And that shaped a social psyche to the point where people who were very, very sick on their deathbed, who could have actually had their pain alleviated by it or had it eased their journey, wouldn't take it because they believe it's evil, because their psyche has been shaped in this way throughout laws. And now we're starting to have a bit more of a nuanced understanding that, yes, it does have medicinal value for some people, but also that it does require health, support in the health sector, and that it needs to be managed as well. And so there's a much more kind of balanced discussion happening now over time as well. But for me, the powerful part of that story is how laws shape our idea of what is moral and immoral and what is good and what is bad. Now, if that can happen over 50 years, imagine what the narrative of a law can do to society over 500 years. And these laws that essentially ascribe entitlement to groups to say finders keepers, and to say that, it's okay to just claim some land over there if you're the first, Pākehā person that's arrived there, all of these ideas of entitlement have been embedded into legal systems that have shaped social psyches for 500 years. So the second thing is to understand how it has shaped the psyche of your organisation. What are some of the ideas of entitlement that have crept into an organisation? And when you understand your relationship to it, so it is a big story, but then you need to understand what is the big story, and then bring us up close, face to face with it, and say, and how do we interact and intersect with this story? When you have those two understandings, that's going to inform your pathway from that point on around how you might dismantle it, because how we dismantle it in Gisborne District Council might look completely different to how they dismantle it even in Tauranga Council. And then again, in another organisation altogether, like a union, your dismantling journey might look different. But you need to understand it through understanding the broader story and then understanding your relationship to it.
So it would be a good suggestion from me, actually, and there are many comments that come across in the chat room, that there are members out there that are have read the doctrine of discovery. So when we're looking at members of the union, because it'll be a good place to start for members, for unions, worksite reps throughout the union, NZEI as a whole, to get a good understanding of this doctrine, so that when we look at, say, ideas of entitlement, if I use the phrase lightly, for members, when we're member driven in NZEI, that do they really understand what that means? It goes back to the wording of understanding. When you're looking at the campaigns that we've driven in NZEI, when we're looking at pay, for the equity and pay for mana taurite, when you're looking at that, do they fully understand what an entitlement means? Because in a worksite itself, when you've got the worksite rep, that person is explaining it, well, through an experience, have been explaining it over and over again. If I use the word entitlement in quite a wide, if we say, comment or view about that one. And when you're looking at also for Middle Māori and the union, not at the word as such as entitlement, but when you're looking at it as maybe as a disposition for Middle Māori within the union, because Middle Māori membership within our union is quite low. I come from an Aranui Tōmua, which is, membership is Māori, but we do have Māori that are members from a branch or mainstream. So for us in Aranui Tōmua, it's about encouraging our members to be part of what we stand for as Middle Māori members. So, it's quite a disposition, if you like, looking at that itself in mainstream and Māori, because you have about 6%, maybe 6 to 8% Māori members for Aranui Tōmua across a 55,000 membership. How do you go about the placement or position of encouraging them to come back to where we are? What's an idea? What do you think's an idea, Tina?
So, one of the things that is really important, there's a couple of things I would say. One is that if people have an interest in anti-racism, the story of the doctrine of discovery is really pivotal, and there's a lot that it's easy to find online around what are the general, racism is a social illness, first of all. So if you're looking at it from a whare tapa whā perspective around the well-being of the community, then this racism is a social illness that is pervasive, that also impacts upon our communal well-being regardless of your ethnicity. It impacts upon the level of communal well-being. It's not economically viable. There's a whole lot of work that's been done around how important it is to unpick to dismantle racism. And so if you're at all interested in genuinely being anti-racist and you understand the communal impacts of racism, then understanding the doctrine of discovery is important on 2 points. One, if you're in Aotearoa, the specific kind of, colonial racism, which is, what the doctrine of discovery is about at its core, colonial racism, is the bedrock of all racism in Aotearoa. You can unpick every other kind of racism before you get to colonial racism. And that is because colonial racism in Aotearoa is really the backbone of our economy. Our economy has been built off dispossession of Māori lands for the creation of the farming economy and the forestry economy, everything. So the natural resource-based economy of New Zealand is built off the dispossession of Māori people, which has been facilitated through the application of the doctrine of discovery, which is what makes it the most difficult kind of racism to unpick in Aotearoa, and it's what makes it the foundational form of racism in Aotearoa as well. So it's really important for us, for our national well-being, for our social well-being on a national stage, to understand that. And then because racism travelled around the world by virtue of the doctrine of discovery and the globalisation, the doctrine of discovery is what globalised racism. It arrived here, as Ani Mikaere says, it arrived here with guns on a boat. And so understanding that also helps us to understand it in a global sense because it carried it around the world, but it also helps us to understand the very specific form of colonial racism that is pervasive throughout Aotearoa. So there's that. And then the other part of that also is for us to understand the promise of dismantling the doctrine of discovery, because it also has underpinned this global, and as I said at the very beginning, I believe all of us have a general compass that's set towards being good and just. We all want to be good, just people. And so understanding the way in which the doctrine of discovery has underpinned corporate imperialism. It started off as classic imperialism, European imperialism, but it set in train a series of economic events around the extraction from Indigenous lands and whatnot that created this global system of economic injustice and this ongoing corporate imperial state that global and corporate imperial behaviour that underpins climate change and oil and gas exploitation and real existential crises for all of us. So understanding how this shaped a social psyche of racism around the world and how that impacts all of us, understanding how it has shaped a global economy and a situation of global economic injustice that creates an existential crisis for all of our mokopuna of all ethnicities is what drives us to understand this. And also understanding how this is actually understanding the way in which the psyche of the doctrine of discovery impedes us from being good tangata tiriti. Because if you're going to be living under the provisions of the doctrine of discovery, you will not help yourself but to violate te tiriti over and over again. And we always have to remember that te tiriti o Waitangi is the foundation of the rights of non-Māori in this land. It is a formative document for this land, a foundational document for this land, but it's also a beautiful document where if you weren't of this land, you can find your home in this land. And so for our tangata tiriti, for our whānau who are not Māori, who are tangata tiriti, it is so vital for us to understand what it is to be a good tangata tiriti, and understanding the doctrine of discovery is important for that, to honour our rights as tangata tiriti as well.
I like that phrase, tangata te tiriti, because it's been really appropriate for us at this time, is that the Aranui Tomo o Kahuranaki put forward a resolution change. It was a rule change. In our rules, it was documented that chairpersons could attend an annual meeting, but there was no placement for dual chairs to attend an annual meeting. So Aranui Tomo Kahuranaki put forward a resolution to add dual chairpersons because of the status that I am one of a dual chairs in Central East, and both of us couldn't attend an annual meeting. So, this is quite appropriate at this time to have the discussion about anti-racism, about the institutional journey of, and also for us acknowledging the te tiriti, because that was the bullet point, one of the bullet points that we put forward for our resolution to change the rule. And it's the beginning of a journey for us as Māori to look at ourselves and say yes, and also in the relationships that we have with Tauiwi mainstream, for that journey to happen. I believe that it is happening within NZI Tiruiroa. It has started, but we have to bring everyone on the waka so we have your word, the understanding. Even though you've brought it in the doctrine of discovery, it's an understanding that we can all work together in NZI, both mainstream and both middle Māori. So, it is really, we brought up in our resolution for the tiriti of Waitangi, we brought up the code of ethics for NZI, and also the equity and the social justice for us as middle Māori, myself as a dual chair, to attend a meeting. So it's been really timely that this discussion has come about with yourself, Tina, and within your role. Yeah.
And I want to say, there have been some of the most profound discussions I've had over the years with organisations and institutions who have wanted to have a look at the doctrine of discovery and how it might be perpetuating racism within their context, has funnily enough been from the church. And I say funnily enough because the full name of the doctrine of discovery is the doctrine of Christian discovery, because it was based upon these papal laws that came out of the church. And it was, I've always viewed it as an economic exercise, because even in that first papal bull in 1453, it said that you can do all of this for your profit. And so I've always believed the intention to be quite economic, but the church featured really strongly as one of the tools and one of the themes in this story. But you do have some amazing leadership. And they do even say that they had a document called El Requerimiento that they would read out when they arrived on the lands. Well, sometimes it was just when they saw the land as a distant dot on the horizon, and they'd read out to the natives in Latin, which the natives didn't understand, of course, that we have come to claim your land, and we do this with the rights of God that has been, and his authority that's been given to us, and if you should oppose us, then we have the right to kill you and do horrible things to your wives and children. And so, you know, the things that they used to read out even back then were quite, like, you know, it was a crazy level of entitlement, and a part of that was that you will submit to the yoke of the cross and the crown. And so the cross and the crown are two really strong players in this story. And what I've found, and as I mentioned really early on in my kōrero, United Nations called upon signatory member states, including New Zealand, to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and to include it in national curriculums. Not one, since that was 2012, and Matua Moana Jackson was one of the leads of the workshop at the UN around that. They met for 2 weeks. The United Nations in New York had a 2-week meeting about the doctrine of discovery because they understood that it is one of the major drivers of Indigenous dispossession around the world. And they gave formal recommendations to all member states to repudiate it. None of them have, not one has responded to those recommendations. But do you know who has responded? The Mennonite Church, the Mihinari Church of England and Canada. You know, there are multiple churches around the world who are now starting to respond to this history of the doctrine of discovery. Actually, I can give you a link. There's a documentary and a film and panel discussion tomorrow on the doctrine of discovery that's sponsored by the Mennonite Church. That's an online one that people might be interested to. And I saw a question came up earlier. Somebody asked for web resources. You can go to tinangata.com, and I have my book for free download on the doctrine of discovery on my page, tinangata.com. Another excellent book that I would recommend is Pagans in the Promised Land by Steve Newcomb. He is the internationally recognised guru of the doctrine of discovery. And then doctrineofdiscovery.org is essentially a website that started out of a study group in the United States. And our Haudenosaunee Mohawk Nation whānau have really carried the flame for decades now around understanding the doctrine of discovery and how it's impacted Indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'm really pleased that that's come about, and I see from a lot of the comments that have come up so far that, yes, our members are going to go out there, and probably you'll be rushed for some resources of some kind, Tina. But, you know, for the members of NZI Turuiroa, our health and well-being is at the foremost. If we don't have that first, how can we progress to move to something else? So in the light of COVID, now post-COVID, we're still in that pathway. So many of the points that you brought up for discussion today can help us along that pathway. So it's a big mihi to you, Tina, that you've enlightened me in quite a lot of things. And it's been quite brilliant, and we could go on listening for you for hours. No?
We can talk about it for hours.
Mihi nui toku aroha kia o koe, Tina, mō tō kōrero, mō tēnei, mō tētahi kaupapa nei, he kaupapa nui tā tātou, tā tātou tangata I Aotearoa, nā ahakoa nohia, tēnei he tino kaupapa mā tātou. Yeah, so we're getting kia ora korua mō korua kōrero, whakawhiti kōrero. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not going to say nothing because I knew you guys could carry this, and you had everything you have said we needed to hear and needed to be enlightened about. And it was time, from the beginning.
Ai, kuhipa ke te wā.
Ai.
But now, at this point in time, there seems to be a surge coming from a younger generation as well, who are asking, why wasn't it? Why wasn't I able to do this as a non-Māori in Aotearoa? Why was I not given the right? And vice, you know, from both parties, from everybody, from people who have come to New Zealand, and they're like, well, why don't we hear the language all the time? Like we should be doing. So it is definitely a huge surge coming through, and the time is tēnei wā. And he miharo tō kōrero, miharo, tēnō miharo, and great timing with our passing of our new law yesterday. With now we can have both chair represented at a hui conference, at our conferences where that's their job, is to be the voice of